The late afternoon sun gilded Seattle's glass buildings, reflecting a city that seemed perpetually in a race against time. There sat Ethan Walker, 32, a programmer, a man who appeared to have everything under control, but inwardly he waged silent wars. Every morning, Ethan repeated the same ritual. He'd wake up late, check his phone before even leaving bed, drink coffee while staring into the void, and promise himself that, tomorrow, I'll start making changes. This tomorrow had already stretched for 3 years. He dreamed of launching his own tech company, but self-sabotage was his secret routine. There was always an excuse: I'm not ready, it's not the right time, I need to study more. The truth was, Ethan didn't fear failure. He feared discovering who he would be without the burden of his own limitations. At night, lying in his small apartment in the Capitol Hill neighborhood, he would stare at the ceiling and feel the emptiness grow. Amidst the distant patter of rain against the window and the muffled hum of street traffic, he would wonder, why can't I just act? His reflection in the mirror no longer seemed familiar. There were dark circles under his eyes, slumped shoulders, and a sadness he tried to mask with irony. Outwardly, an exemplary professional. Inwardly, a man exhausted by unfulfilled promises. On that particular day, unknowingly, Ethan was mere weeks away from a breakdown and a rebirth. But for now, he only felt the invisible weight of his own self-sabotage, the kind of prison that has no bars but slowly consumes the soul. Ethan's days followed a pattern so predictable he could sketch them with his eyes closed. Work from 9 to 6 at a software firm in downtown Seattle, a solitary walk to the subway, headphones filled with melancholic tunes, and the same quick dinner, instant noodles and silence. In the office, Ethan was respected. He was the guy who tackled complex coding problems and was always willing to lend a hand to colleagues. But when it came to his own life, he faltered. Praise made him uncomfortable. Success frightened him. He possessed a rare talent for downplaying his own achievements. When he received recognition, he'd say things like, "Oh, it was just luck. Anyone would have done the same. I still have." There was much to learn. Deep down, Ethan believed he didn't deserve to succeed. This belief, born from a past of constant criticism and familial comparison, clung to him like a shadow. His mother, a nurse who raised her children alone, always said, "Don't dream too big, Ethan. Be practical." And he learned to pare down his aspirations to fit the expectations of others. His friends noticed something was amiss. "Dude, you've been talking about starting your own company for years. What's stopping you?" Liam, his best friend since college, would ask. Ethan would smirk, look away, and reply with a tone that mingled sarcasm and apprehension. "Oh, maybe I'm waiting for the universe to send me a sign." But the universe sent nothing. It merely watched patiently as Ethan repeated the same cycle: desire, plan, procrastinate, and abandon. It was an invisible script, a self-destructive mental pattern. Ethan's self-sabotage hid behind sophisticated excuses. He'd read about productivity, watch motivational videos, jot down detailed plans, and the next day do nothing. The issue wasn't a lack of knowledge, but a deficit of self-belief. One evening, staring at his open laptop with an unfinished project, Ethan whispered to himself, "Maybe I'm just not cut out for this." And as he uttered the words, something within him ached, a silent, profound pain, not from failure, but from the knowledge that he was betraying his own potential. The Seattle winter arrived stealthily, blanketing the city in a cold rain that seemed unending. Ethan felt much the same, trapped in a tempest brewing from within. The weeks began to drag. At work, deadlines loomed, and he started missing crucial deliverables. Code that once flowed effortlessly now stalled before his weary eyes. He found himself staring at the screen for minutes on end, fingers still, heart pounding, his mind a cacophony of self-recriminating thoughts. One day his boss, Michael, called him in for a chat. "Ethan, you're talented, but you're different. You lack focus, motivation. Has something happened?" He attempted to mask it with a weak smile. "No, I'm fine, just tired." But Michael pressed on. "You've always been one of our best. I just don't want you to get lost in your own perfectionism." The word perfectionism echoed in Ethan's mind. Yes, perhaps it was this, but in reality it was the fear of not being good enough. At home, the isolation intensified. Messages from friends went unanswered, food spoiled in the refrigerator, and the guitar he used to play on weekends leaned in the corner, covered in dust. The days blurred together. Time passed, but he did not. One night, after missing a significant opportunity to pitch an app idea to an investor, Ethan had a breakdown. He sat on the floor of his apartment, lights off, and let the silence engulf him. Tears streamed down his face, not from sadness, but from the exhaustion of always being his own impediment. "I'm tired of myself," he murmured. It was the first moment he admitted what he had always known. He was his own worst enemy. There was no one else to blame. The mirror watched him from afar, the reflection of a man who had always dreamed of being free, but who had shackled himself with his own chains. That night, Ethan realized how far he had strayed from the person he once aspired to be. And for the first time, he feared he would never find himself again. The morning after his breakdown, Ethan woke up late, his eyes swollen and his mind numb. Beside the bed, his laptop remained open to the same screen. Incomplete code, a reflection of his own life. The sound of light rain tapping against the window was almost hypnotic. Without much thought, he picked up his phone and opened a social media app. Amidst random videos, one caught his attention. An older man with a serene gaze said with a firm voice, "Are you tired of sabotaging yourself? Transformation doesn't happen when the world changes. It happens when you decide to stop running from yourself." Ethan froze. It was as if the video had been recorded specifically for him. Those words pierced him in a way nothing else had. For the first time in months, he felt something different, a mixture of shame and hope. That very day, he decided to leave the house. He walked to a coffee shop near Lake Union, a place he used to frequent when he needed to think. There, he coincidentally ran into Liam, his friend. Liam looked at him with surprise and concern. "Dude, you disappeared. What happened?" Ethan took a deep breath. "I got lost. Truly lost. I spent so long pretending everything was fine that I started to believe it. In my own lie." Liam listened silently, then replied, "Then perhaps it's time to stop pretending and start changing. You don't need to be ready, you just need to begin." Those words were the final catalyst. Ethan glanced at his reflection in the coffee shop window, a tired yet alive face. It was as if something within him finally declared, "Enough." That night, back in his apartment, he opened the same notebook where he kept his old plans. On the first page, he wrote in large letters, "Today is the day I chose to stop sabotaging myself." The fear was still present, but something new had also been born, the will to act. No longer waiting for the right moment, he would create the right moment. And if you also feel you've been sabotaging yourself, that life is on pause, remember, you don't need to be ready, you need to begin. Continue following stories like this. Subscribe so you don't miss the next transformation journey. The first few days of Ethan's new decision were not glorious, and he knew they wouldn't be. Transformation, he quickly discovered, doesn't come with an inspiring soundtrack or light effects. It begins in silence, in small choices that almost no one notices. The following Monday, he did something simple yet symbolic. He got up without looking at his phone. He had coffee calmly, opened the windows, and breathed in the crisp Seattle air before heading to work. It wasn't a grand achievement, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't start the day judging himself. During his workday, he took out the notebook where he'd written, "Today is the day I chose to stop sabotaging myself," and kept it open on his desk. It was his silent reminder. When anxiety tried to push him toward procrastination, he'd read that sentence and take a deep breath. But the mind, accustomed to fleeing, doesn't surrender easily. That week, he attempted to resume the app project he had abandoned. He opened the code, began reviewing, and shortly after, the old inner voice returned. "You'll fail again." For a moment, he almost closed the computer. But something within him whispered, "What if this time I don't give up?" It was the first act of resistance. An hour later, the code ran. Small, imperfect, but it worked. And Ethan smiled to himself, not for the outcome, but for having conquered his own mind for a day. In the days following, he began to make small changes. He resumed playing guitar on Friday nights, reconnected with friends, and started taking late afternoon walks. Each step seemed to reclaim a piece of himself. One day, Liam found him at the coffee shop again and said, "You look different. You seem lighter." Ethan chuckled. "Maybe I'm just learning to stop being my own worst enemy." But even with these incremental advances, he knew, self-sabotage doesn't vanish, it merely waits for the first sign of fatigue to resurface. And it would resurface. The difference was that, this time, Ethan wouldn't flee. The winter began to recede, and the days in Seattle seemed a little less gray. Ethan did too. He was no longer the man who woke up late, complained about life, and waited for motivation to fall from the sky. He still had bad days, of course, but now they didn't define him. Every morning at 6:30 a.m., his alarm would ring and he'd get up without overthinking it. He discovered the secret wasn't waiting for the desire, but rather cultivating discipline even in its absence. He ran through the damp neighborhood streets, watching the sunrise glint off Lake Union. It was a quiet ritual of reconstruction. Gradually, he began to feel pride in the small routines he had once disdained. Making his own coffee, tidying his workspace, completing a task on time. These minor victories built a self-confidence he had never experienced before. At work, Michael, his boss, noticed the shift. "You're back to being the Ethan you used to be, maybe even better." Ethan smiled, surprised. "I think I've finally stopped fighting myself." In the evenings, instead of losing himself in distractions, he dedicated an hour to his personal project. The app, now rebranded as Rise, a nod to the act of getting up, began to take shape. It was a digital space aimed at those looking to overcome procrastination and build new habits. A mirror of the very journey he was undertaking. Of course, his mind still tried to test him. Sometimes the thought would arise, what if none of this is worth it? But he learned to respond mentally. What if it is? That was how he conquered, one thought at a time. On weekends, Ethan started attending personal growth groups. There, he heard stories from people who had also sabotaged themselves out of fear, and for the first time, he didn't feel alone. He understood that the self-sabotage wasn't a flaw, it was a cry from the mind seeking healing. It was in that moment that something within him solidified. He wasn't just changing habits, he was becoming someone new, someone capable of self-care, self-belief, and action despite fear. Months had elapsed since that morning when Ethan had written in his notebook, "Today is the day I choose to stop sabotaging myself." Now, rereading the sentence, it seemed penned by someone else, an older version of him, someone who had finally been left in the past. The Rise app was nearly complete. It wasn't perfect, but Ethan had learned a liberating truth. Perfect is what's done. He no longer waited to feel confident to act. Now he acted even with fear. And with each step, the fear receded a little. The project began to garner attention. Colleagues wanted to test the prototype, and even Michael, the boss, expressed interest. "This could help a lot of people, Ethan, including me." Those words resonated deeply with him, not out of vanity but from the realization that his personal transformation was starting to inspire others. At home, the walls no longer felt constricting. The apartment, once dim and cluttered, now boasted plants, books, and light. It was as if the environment mirrored his internal shift. Ethan also began to nurture his body and mind with intention. He enrolled in yoga classes and resumed the practice of journaling his reflections. Once he wrote, "Life doesn't change when you understand your fears, but rather when you decide to act in spite of them." This newfound way of living astonished him. When things went awry, and they still did frequently, he no longer spiraled into guilt. He would take a deep breath, recalibrate, and move forward. It was as if he had finally made peace with his own rhythm. Self-sabotage still whispered at times, attempting to convince him that none of this would last. But now he knew these voices weren't adversaries, they were wounded parts of himself, clamoring for attention. And by listening to them with compassion, they lost their hold. On a sun-drenched afternoon, seated at a lakeside cafe, Ethan gazed at the horizon and perceived something simple yet transformative. He no longer wished to be someone else. He simply wanted to be true to the version of himself that was emerging, authentic, imperfect, and real. It was an April Friday in Seattle. It had dawned under a gray sky, typical of the fickle spring of the American Northwest. Ethan was mere days away from officially launching Rise. The project had garnered visibility at a local conference, and an investor had expressed interest in funding the final version. It seemed like the dawn of a new chapter, until the past came knocking. That morning he received an email. The investor was canceling the meeting. Reason? Shift in priorities. Interesting project, but outside current scope. Ethan felt his body go cold. For several minutes, he remained motionless before the screen, his mind flooded with old voices. "You're not good enough. I knew this was too big for you. Nothing you do lasts." It was as if months of progress began to crumble all at once. The urge to give up resurfaced with full force. He closed the laptop, turned off the lights, and collapsed onto the sofa, the same setting as when he was trapped by self-sabotage. The difference was now he knew what was happening. He took a deep breath. He opened the notebook where he had written his initial promise. He flipped to the most recent page where a phrase was noted. "Transformation isn't about never falling, it's about learning to get up faster." He read it and wept. He wept not for the lost opportunity, but for realizing how much he still craved external validation to feel capable. The true test wasn't failure, it was continuing even without applause. He slowly got up, went to the window, and watched the rain begin to fall. He remembered Liam, Michael, the people from his personal growth group, and all the times he had nearly given up. Not this time. He returned to the computer, reopened the project, and wrote a new goal. I will launch Rise, with or without investment. The purpose is greater than the fear. At that moment, something within him solidified. It was as if the old Ethan, the one who always sabotaged himself, had taken his last breath. He realized that true power lay not in conquering others, but in not giving up on himself. The wind beat against the window, and the city seemed to bear witness to the rebirth of a man finally freeing himself from his own pattern of pain. Ethan was ready. Not for success, but to live with purpose even when nothing guaranteed the outcome. 3 months passed. Since that rainy afternoon, the Rise app was live. No investors, no major campaigns, just Ethan's quiet effort and the help of a few friends who believed in the idea. On the first day, he received 27 downloads. On the second, 56. And within a week, over 1,000 people were using the app. Ordinary people trying to overcome procrastination, lack of focus, self-sabotage. Every thank you message that arrived was a reminder. What he had created was helping others conquer the battles he himself had fought. But Ethan's true transformation wasn't in the numbers. It was in the way he now lived. He no longer ran away from pain, but walked towards understanding what it wanted to teach him. He didn't judge himself for failing. He forgave himself, learned, and started over. One evening, while walking along the shore of Lake Union, Liam found him again. Man, I saw Rise on social media. You're inspiring a lot of people. Ethan smiled without his old embarrassment. You know what's funny, Liam? I spent my life trying to be perfect to feel worthy, and it was only when I accepted being imperfect that I started truly living. They fell silent for a few seconds, watching the reflection of the city lights dance on the water. Ethan continued, I thought I needed courage to change. But I discovered that courage only appears when we stop sabotaging ourselves and start acting, even when afraid. At home, he wrote in his journal, there is no final version of ourselves, only continuously updating versions. The apartment was now full of life. On the table, a vase of sunflowers. In the background, the soft sound of the guitar he had started playing again. It was simple but sincere. He had finally understood that true transformation doesn't happen when everything goes right, but when you learn to keep going even when nothing seems to go right. And that night, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not because he had conquered all his fears, but because he had finally stopped fighting himself. A year later, Seattle sparkled under a rare sunny day. The cafes were full, the streets buzzed with music, and the air carried the sweet scent of spring. Ethan walked calmly towards a bookstore downtown, now one of his favorite places. He had a serene countenance, the same gaze as before, but without the haste, without the weight, without the shadow. Rise had surpassed 50,000 users. He now lectured at universities on emotional discipline and overcoming self-sabotage. But above all, he taught by example. During his talks, he didn't speak of success, he spoke of failures. He recounted the night he cried on the floor, the times he wanted to give up, and the moment he realized that the greatest act of courage is not giving up on oneself. After one of these lectures, a young woman approached him. Ethan, I saw myself in your story. I'm afraid to start anything, and I always end up getting stuck. What do I do? He thought for a moment and replied with a calm smile. Don't wait until you feel ready. Start anyway. Fear isn't a signal to stop, it's a signal that you're about to grow. She smiled back, moved. Ethan watched her walk away and realized that his journey was, in some way, multiplying in the lives of others. That night, sitting by the lake, he opened his journal again. He wrote with a blue pen, his handwriting firm and calm. I spent years sabotaging myself, believing I needed something outside of myself to be happy. But the truth is, everything I was looking for was already here, waiting for me to have the courage to look within. He closed the notebook and, for the first time, felt he didn't need to plan the future. He was living it. The wind touched his face and the city lights reflected on the calm waters. Ethan smiled in silence, like someone who finally understands that life doesn't change overnight. It changes the day you decide to change. If this story touched you, remember, perhaps today is your day to stop sabotaging yourself and start transforming. Leave a like, comment what resonated with you the most, and subscribe to follow other stories like this, about fresh starts, courage, and the invisible strength that lives within you.